There is a question I have been asked more than once in my working life, and I never answered it fully until the autumn I turned 74. The question is simple enough. It goes like this: why do your walls look different from everyone else's? I built my first house in Pembina County in the spring of 1879 when I was 22 years old and still learning which end of a framing square to trust. I built my last in 1912 when my knees had begun their slow campaign of protest against ladders and cold mornings. Somewhere between those two dates, the walls I built became noticeably thicker than the walls my neighbors built, not by accident, not by excess of material, but by decision, a specific decision made in a specific winter, taught to me by a person whose name I did not say often enough in the years that followed. My grandnephew came to visit me that September of 1931. He is a practical young man, the kind who notices things. He had driven up from Fargo in a Ford that still smelled of the factory, and after supper, he walked around the outside of my house the way young men do when they are trying to understand something without asking about it directly. Then he came and sat on the porch steps and asked the question. I looked north for a while before I answered. There is a habit I have developed in old age, looking north before I speak about certain things, as if the answer might be visible out there on the flat line where the sky meets the earth. It never is. But the looking helps me remember the right order of things. There was a woman, I told him. Her name was Astrid Voss. She was Norwegian, widowed, and alone on 160 acres of Red River bottomland when the worst winter this territory has ever recorded came down out of Canada and tried to kill everyone it could reach. She had spent the 2 months before that winter taking her cabin walls apart and putting them back together in a way that nobody in this county had ever seen or thought to try. And what I know about building walls, what is actually worth knowing, I learned from watching what she had done and understanding slowly, over many years, why every decision she made was correct. He waited for more. I told him he would have to be patient because the story did not begin in Dakota. The winter of 1880 to 1881 is known in the histories of this territory, on the occasions when it is known at all, as the snow winter. The name is accurate but insufficient, the way calling the ocean wet is accurate but insufficient. From the first week of October 1880 until the third week of April 1881, the northern plains received snow in quantities that made experienced men revise their understanding of what the word winter was capable of containing. Storms came every 2 to 3 weeks, one following the next before the previous one had fully settled. The temperature in January dropped to 38 degrees below zero on the coldest nights, and the wind that accompanied those temperatures was not the kind of wind a man walked into comfortably and came home from without consequence. The supply wagons from the south stopped running in late November. The rail line, which had only recently made its way into parts of the territory, froze solid and remained frozen. What the settlers of Pembina County had in October was what they would have until April. No more arriving, no resupply, no second chances built into the arithmetic. Firewood was the arithmetic. Every family knew their cord count the way a man knows the amount left in his wallet in a place where there are no banks nearby. 11 cords would see a household through a normal winter if the cabin was reasonably tight and the family was not wasteful. The snow winter was not a normal winter, and no cabin on the Red River bottomland was as tight as its builder had believed when he built it. The cabins of Pembina County in 1880 were constructed, nearly without exception, in the manner that had proven adequate across the American frontier for the previous 40 years. A single thickness of milled or hand-hewn board, generally 1 inch to 1 1/4 inches, formed the exterior wall. Gaps between boards were chinked with whatever was available. Rye straw was common, Gray River clay, packed wet and allowed to dry. Burlap soaked in linseed oil in the cabins of men who had thought ahead. On a still day in October, with the sun at a reasonable angle, such a wall kept the interior temperature manageable with 2 fires a day and moderate wood consumption. On a January night at 30 below, with wind pressing against the north face of the cabin at 50 miles an hour. That same wall was approximately as effective as a wool coat with the lining removed. Heat generated inside by the stove rose to the ceiling, pooled briefly, and then found every gap and thin place in the construction and departed for the outside, where it was of no use to anyone. The families of the Stillwater, the Red River settlements, though I catch myself still borrowing the names of other stories sometimes, burned through their wood at rates that made men do mathematics in their heads at 3 in the morning, and not like the answers they came up with. By February of that winter, 3 households had burned through their entire supply, and were accepting charity from neighbors who could not well afford to give it. One family burned their second-best furniture in the last week of March. 2 others lost cattle they could not bring to shelter, and the loss of those cattle meant a spring planting season that was thinner than it should have been, and a year that was harder than it needed to be. This is the country into which Astrid Voss was working with her pry bar in October of 1880, taking apart walls that most of her neighbors had not yet identified as inadequate. She was 52 years old that autumn. Her husband Eric had died in April, pneumonia, following a winter that had given him a cough he could not clear, and then a cold spring that would not let it heal. Eric Voss was a careful man and a hard worker, and he had built their cabin 12 years before with the best materials available to him at the time. The walls were standard. The chinking was rye straw. He had intended to improve them and had not gotten around to it, the way a man always intends to improve the thing that is functional but not yet right, and life fills the space where the improvement would have gone. Astrid had 2 sons. Thomas the elder had been gone to Winnipeg for 3 years, working on the railway expansion north. Martin had followed him the previous summer. They were good sons in the way that sons who leave are good sons. They wrote letters, they sent money when they had it, they worried about their mother from a sufficient distance that the worrying cost them nothing inconvenient. Thomas's letter had arrived in August. Astrid described it to me once, years later, in the particular tone she used for things she found both understandable and beside the point. He had written carefully. He had written with affection. He had explained, in the patient way of a young man who has recently acquired city habits and therefore believes his mother may not have thought things through, that a widow of her age alone on a Dakota homestead was an unnecessary risk, that Winnipeg had opportunities, that he had spoken with a woman who ran a respectable boarding house, that the land could be sold for a fair price, that there was no shame in it, that father would have wanted her to be safe. She read the letter twice. She set it on the table. She did not read it a third time. What she did instead was take a length of wire, she kept a coil of it for repairs, and push it into the gap between 2 boards on the north wall. The wire went through without resistance. She pulled it back. The end was cold and faintly damp. She stood there for a while, looking at the wall. Then she went to the tool chest and found the pry bar. I did not know any of this in October of 1880. I was 23 years old, apprenticed to a carpenter named Sid Garvey, who had built structures across 3 counties and considered himself expert in all matters of frontier construction, which he largely was. I rode past the Voss place on an errand to Walhalla on a morning in mid-October and saw something that stopped me at the fence line for a full minute before I rode on. The north wall of her cabin was open to the sky, not collapsed, removed. The outer boards were stacked beside the foundation in a neat row, each one marked with a charcoal number so they could be replaced in sequence. Behind them, the bare interior structure of the wall was exposed, the rough studs, the gaps between, the accumulated evidence of 12 years of winter pressing in from the north. Old chinking had fallen out in sections. In one place, a bird had nested in a gap, and the nest was still there, gray and flattened. Astrid was not visible. She was, I later understood, down at the river, hauling clay. I sat on my horse and looked at that open wall, and I thought what any practical person would think in the 3rd week of October in Dakota Territory. She will not finish before the cold comes. I thought it without malice. I thought it the way you observe that a man has started a long journey in the afternoon, not hoping he fails, simply noting the arithmetic. I rode on to Walhalla and mentioned it to Sid Garvey when I got back. He shook his head in the manner of a man who has seen many things go wrong on the frontier and has made his peace with the fact that he cannot prevent all of them. He said Mrs. Voss had lost her husband in the spring and that grief did strange things to a person's judgment. He said no more about it. The community, if I am being precise, did not mock Astrid Voss. Mockery requires attention, and Astrid had very little of that. She was a Norwegian widow in her 50s, on a homestead that most of her neighbors had already begun, privately, to write off as too much for a single woman to manage. Clarence Mott, who owned the largest operation in the county, rode past her place twice that October on his way to and from Walhalla. He stopped once to observe the open wall, as I had. He said nothing to her that day because she was not visible. He mentioned it to his wife Margaret that evening, not with contempt, but with a kind of resigned arithmetic of his own, the kind that calculates whether a neighbor will need assistance before spring. That Swedish woman, Garvey called her once, though she was Norwegian. On the frontier, Northern European was often Northern European, the distinctions immaterial to men who had not been to either place. She was not the subject of serious conversation in any household I knew of that October. She was simply a widow doing something unusual with her walls. There were more pressing concerns. The signs of the coming winter were already visible to anyone paying attention. The geese had moved south 3 weeks earlier than usual. The beaver work along the river showed dams built unusually high, and the men who had been in the territory long enough to read those signs were quietly revising their cord estimates upward and cutting more wood than they had originally planned. Astrid Voss was mixing clay on the Red River bank and carrying it home in Eric's old wheelbarrow, 3 loads a day, stopping to rest when her back required it, and then continuing. She was not thinking about her neighbor's opinions. She was thinking about her father's hands. Her father, I should tell you, had built walls in Norway that a Dakota winter could not have touched, and she had watched him build them. She had helped him build them. She had carried that knowledge across an ocean and a continent and 18 years of American winters in which she had not used it, because Eric had already built the cabin, and there was always something more immediately necessary than rebuilding a wall that was functional, if not right. Now there was nothing more immediately necessary. Eric was gone. Thomas's letter was on the table. The wire had gone through the wall without resistance. The wall was open. The river clay was blue-gray and cold in her hands, and it smelled the way her father's building sites had smelled, and she was, for the first time in a long while, doing exactly the right thing. There are 2 ways a person carries knowledge across a long distance. The first is in the memory, which is warm and imprecise and subject to the distortions that time and emotion work on everything they touch. The second is on paper, which is cold and precise and subject to the distortions that water, fire, mice, and the simple indifference of subsequent generations work on everything they fail to protect. Astrid Voss carried her father's knowledge both ways, and the tension between those 2 versions, what she remembered and what was written, was present in every decision she made that October. I did not understand this fully until she explained it to me in the spring of 1881, when I was measuring her walls and trying to make sense of certain choices that had puzzled me. She went to the chest at the foot of her bed and came back with a small ledger, the kind used for farm accounts. The cover was dark brown leather, worn smooth at the corners. She set it on the table and opened it to a page in the middle. The writing inside was her father's, Lars Hagen, of Telemark, Norway, a builder of houses and barns and the occasional small bridge for a period of approximately 30 years before his hands gave out. He had written in a mixture of Norwegian and something that Astrid described as his own private shorthand, developed over decades of recording things he did not want to forget, and had not yet found the right words for. The diagrams were clearer than the text. There were cross-sections of walls drawn with a steady hand, dimensions noted in units that were not American, and in the margins of several pages, small additional notations in a different ink added later, which Astrid identified as corrections he had made after observing his own work through subsequent winters. Her father had been, in his particular and unannounced way, a man who revised his conclusions in light of evidence. Astrid considered this his most important quality as a builder. "I cannot always read his hand," she told me, turning to a page that was dense with text, and 2 diagrams of wall cross-sections. Some of this I knew already from watching him work. Some of it I am not certain I am reading correctly. The measurements here, she pointed to a column of figures, I have had to convert, and I am not confident in all of them. But the principle is clear. The principle he never had to write down because he showed it instead. The principle, as she understood it, and as she had watched it demonstrated across 4 separate building projects in the mountains of Telemark before she left Norway at the age of 34, was this. A wall built from a single layer of wood is a wall that mediates between the cold outside and the heat inside without contributing anything of its own. It passes information in both directions. It lets the heat out and the cold in, and it has no opinion about either transaction. Such a wall requires constant fire to compensate for its own indifference. The fire heats the air rises, the heat escapes. The fire must be fed again. This is an argument that can never be won, only temporarily interrupted. A wall built with sufficient mass, with enough material packed into its cavity to have thermal weight, to have what her father called holding, participates differently in the conversation between inside and outside. It absorbs heat during the hours when the fire is active and the interior is warm. It stores that heat within itself, in the molecular patience of dense material, and releases it slowly during the hours when the fire has died to coals and the outside temperature is at its worst. It does not require constant fire. It requires good fire, managed fire, fire that charges the mass sufficiently, and then can be allowed to rest. "A coat does not make heat," Astrid said to me that morning, in her particular way of arriving at an English sentence that was a translation of something that had first existed in Norwegian. "A coat keeps heat where it already is." My father said a wall should work the same way. He said a wall that lets the wind through is not a wall. It is only wood that has understood its own failure. I wrote that down. I am glad I did because I have quoted it to clients and apprentices more times than I can count in the 50 years since, and I have not always been careful to say where it came from. The material her father had used in Telemark was a mixture that the local builders there had refined over generations of cold winters and direct observation of what worked. The base was clay, the blue-gray riverbank clay that was plastic enough to pack without cracking, dense enough to hold heat without requiring excessive thickness, and available within reasonable distance of nearly any building site in the valley country of southern Norway. To the clay her father added 2 things. The first was agricultural chaff, the dry husks remaining after grain was threshed, which the farms of Telemark produced in quantities that exceeded their other uses for it. The chaff served 2 purposes. It reduced the tendency of pure clay to crack as it dried and contracted, and it introduced small air pockets throughout the mass that slightly increased its insulating properties without significantly reducing its thermal weight. The ratio, as best Astrid could read her father's notation, was 2 parts clay to 1 part chaff by loose volume, adjusted for the specific character of the clay available. Drier clay needed more chaff. Wetter clay could accept less. The second addition was sawdust, from whatever mill was nearby. Her father's notation on this point was less precise. He wrote something Astrid translated as enough to make it breathe, and she had interpreted this, based on her memory of watching him mix, as approximately 1 part sawdust to 4 parts of the clay and chaff combined. The sawdust added workability and reduced the tendency of the mix to slump when packed vertically into a wall cavity before it had cured. The Red River of Dakota Territory was not the Telemark Valley. The clay she found in the bank below the property was a different character from what her father had used. Darker, less plastic, with a higher sand content that made it coarser to work with and somewhat more prone to cracking. She spent 2 days testing it before she committed to the full project. She rolled a coil of clay between her palms to the thickness of a finger and bent it slowly into a curve, watching for the point at which it cracked. Her father's clay would hold a full curve without fracture. The Red River clay cracked at approximately 2/3 of a curve. She adjusted her mental ratio accordingly, more chaff to compensate for the clay's reduced cohesion, and made a test brick, which she placed beside the stove to cure for 4 days before she pressed her thumbnail into it and evaluated the result. The test brick was adequate, not her father's clay, but adequate. She found her chaff at the Hansen place, a 1/4 mile east. Per Hansen had burned his threshing chaff the previous week in the usual fashion. There was more of it than any farm had a use for, and burning it was simply what you did. But he had not yet burned the pile behind the east barn. Astrid walked over and explained that she had a use for it. Per Hansen looked at her in the way of a man who does not quite follow the purpose being described, but has no objection to the removal of something he was planning to burn regardless. He told her to take what she needed. She took it all, 3 cartloads, and covered it with canvas against the weather. The sawdust she obtained from the mill at Walhalla on her next supply run, 8 miles south, a full day's trip. She explained to the mill operator what she wanted it for. He was a man named Gerhard Flom, a Dane, and he had an engineer's instinct for structural questions. He asked several of them. She answered them in the direct way she had with practical conversation. He gave her the sawdust at no charge and mentioned that he had heard of something similar being done in buildings in Denmark, though he could not remember the specifics. She thanked him and noted, with a satisfaction she did not express aloud, that the principle she was working from was not apparently limited to one country's understanding. She began on the north wall because the north wall was the wall that mattered most. On the Red River bottomland, the wind that killed came from the north and northeast, uninterrupted across the Canadian plains. A man standing in a field in January could turn his back to the south and feel briefly that the cold was survivable. He could turn to face north and understand, without analysis, exactly what he was dealing with. The outer boards of the north wall were removed one at a time, each one numbered on its inner face with charcoal before it was lifted free. Astrid had learned this from her father as well, who had a strict ethic about the replacement of materials in their original positions. Wood that had weathered and settled in one configuration would not fit as well if returned in another, and the gaps created by poor replacement were precisely the enemy she was trying to eliminate. She stacked the boards in sequence against the south side of the cabin, protected from rain by a section of canvas weighted with stones. With the outer boards removed, the cavity of the wall was exposed. It measured 9 inches deep, framed by the inner boards and the original studs. The existing chinking, rye straw, packed a decade before by Eric, came out in gray, compressed sections, some of it still holding its original shape, some of it disintegrated to powder. She removed it entirely and disposed of it at a distance from the cabin because damp rye straw in enclosed spaces carried the particular smell of things that had given up. The filling proceeded in layers. She mixed each batch of clay on a flat board outside, working it by hand until the consistency was uniform. Her father's test, which she had internalized without knowing she had, was that a properly mixed batch would hold a firm shape when squeezed in the fist, but release without sticking to the palm. She pressed each layer into the cavity and tamped it down with a shaped piece of oak handle before adding the next. The goal was density without voids. A void in the wall was a pocket where cold air could sit and work. She pressed her fingers into corners and around studs with the patience of a person who understood that the unseen parts of a wall are the parts that determine its character. The first section, 6 boards wide, covering roughly 4 feet of the north face, took 2 full days to fill and close. On the third morning, she found it collapsed. Not dramatically, not fallen outward. The clay had contracted as it began to dry, pulling away from the studs in several places, and the weight of the upper section had pressed down on the lower before it had sufficient strength to bear it. 2 of the replaced outer boards were pushed out of true by perhaps half an inch. The fill had slumped in a way that left visible voids along the upper stud edges, visible when she removed a board to inspect. She stood looking at it for a while. Then she went inside and made coffee and sat at the table with her father's ledger open to the page she had already studied many times. There was a notation in the margin, one of the later editions, in the second ink, that she had read before and believed she understood. She read it again more carefully. Her translation of it, as she gave it to me that April morning, was approximately, "Do not close before the clay can stand. The clay must answer for itself before it is asked to bear weight." She had moved too quickly. She had filled and closed in the same sequence her father used in summer, when the warm Norwegian air assisted the curing. In October in Dakota, the air was already cold enough to slow the process considerably. The clay needed longer between layers, and longer again before the outer boards were replaced. She removed the failed section entirely, mixed a new batch, this time with slightly less water and more chaff, which she believed would reduce the initial shrinkage. Filled in thinner layers with a full night of curing between each one, waited 3 days before replacing the outer boards. On the 4th morning she pressed both palms flat against the replaced boards and felt the wall solid and true behind them. She moved to the next section. There is a particular quality to the work of a person who has failed once and understood the failure and corrected it, I told my grandnephew that September evening. It is not the same as the work of a person who has not yet failed. It is steadier. It is less interested in speed. It knows something about the specific way this particular material behaves in this particular condition, which is knowledge that cannot be obtained any other way. Astrid Voss filled the north wall of that cabin 1 4-foot section at a time in October and early November of 1880, while the temperature dropped and her neighbors cut wood and looked at the sky and calculated whether they had enough. She already knew she had enough. She just needed to finish the walls before the answer was tested. By the 1st of November, the north wall was finished. Not perfect. Astrid would not have used that word, and she would have corrected anyone who did. The clay had cured unevenly in 2 sections near the top, where she had been forced to work faster than was ideal because the temperature on that particular week had dropped sharply, and she was concerned that new clay would freeze before it could set. One stud on the western end had a small gap at its base that she had filled with a mixture of ash and dried river grass rather than the primary clay mix, because she had run short of well-mixed material and the light was failing, and the decision had to be made with what was available. She noted both imperfections in her own small ledger, the one she had begun keeping in Norwegian, parallel to her father's, because she believed that building knowledge, not written down, was building knowledge already beginning to disappear. But the wall was sound, and it was dense, and when she placed both palms flat against the inner face on a cold morning after a good evening fire, the warmth that came back into her hands was the warmth she remembered from telemark. Not air warmth. Air warmth is thin and directional and disappears the moment you step away from the source. This was material warmth, the warmth of something that had taken heat into itself and was now returning it at its own pace, indifferent to whether the fire was still burning. She allowed herself one evening of satisfaction. Then she began planning the east wall. The east wall presented a different problem, and it was a problem she had seen coming since the first week of October when she had assessed the property and its materials. The Red River, which had provided her clay for the north wall, had frozen in the 3rd week of October, earlier than usual, and solidly enough by November that the blue-gray clay she needed was now under 2 feet of ice and not accessible without tools she did not have and effort that would have consumed time she could not afford. The north wall had used the better part of what she had stockpiled before the freeze. What remained was perhaps enough for half of the east wall, if she managed it carefully, and not nearly enough for the south and west walls combined. She was not, in the first days of November, certain she would need the south and west walls. The south wall received what winter sun was available, which moderated its heat loss considerably. The west wall faced away from the prevailing wind. The north and east walls were the walls the winter used as its primary point of entry, and if she could get them both filled before the serious cold arrived, she believed she had a reasonable probability of managing. She is working this out, I should tell you, not as strategy, but as arithmetic. Arithmetic was a language Astrid Voss trusted more than most others. When she told me what she had enough material to do and what she did not, she was not being modest or pessimistic. She was being accurate. For the portion of the east wall that would have to be done without clay, she experimented. This is the word she used, experimented, in a tone that did not suggest excitement. It suggested the quiet pragmatism of a person who has identified a problem, has no ideal solution, and is therefore going to work through the available options until she finds one that is adequate. Her first attempt was river grass, the tall, dry grass that grew in dense stands along the bank and could be cut and bundled in quantity. She packed a test section with tight bundled grass, replacing what remained of the original rye straw chinking, and noted the result over 3 cold nights. The insulation was marginal. Better than rye straw, because the bundles were denser and she had packed them with more care. But the grass had no thermal mass. It was too light, too airy, too easily surrendering the heat it briefly held. It would slow heat loss without significantly altering the fundamental exchange. The second attempt combined the remaining grass with stove ash. She had a substantial accumulation of wood ash from 2 weeks of heavy firing. Ash that she had been setting aside in a covered bucket rather than disposing of, on an instinct she had not fully articulated to herself until this problem arose. She mixed the ash with the grass at approximately equal volumes, added a small amount of water to give the ash some binding quality, and packed a second test section alongside the first. The result over 3 nights was better. The ash added weight and density to the grass fill. The combination did not behave like clay. It had less thermal mass, less holding capacity, less of the particular quality that made her father's walls work the way they worked. But it was meaningfully better than the alternative, which was a single board and cold air, and on the frontier in November, meaningfully better is a category of result that earns its own respect. She filled the remainder of the east wall with the ash and grass mixture, used the last of her clay for the sections nearest the corner where the east and north walls met, the corner being the point of greatest vulnerability, the place where 2 cold surfaces converged, and the warmth inside was most easily ambushed, and finished the east wall on the 12th of November. She wrote in her ledger that evening, "East wall done, clay half, ash grass half, not as good as north. Better than nothing." Father would say, "A good wall at the corner is worth 2 good walls in the middle." I think the corner is sound. It was around this time that Clarence Mott made his second observation of the project. He was returning from Walhalla on a gray afternoon, the sky the color of old pewter in the particular way that Dakota skies have in November when they are deciding what to do next. He pulled his horse up at the fence line as I had done 3 weeks earlier. The north wall was closed and looked, from the outside, indistinguishable from any other exterior wall. The same boards, the same weathered gray surface, the same dimensions. The east wall was in the process of being closed, the final boards being replaced one at a time. Astrid was on a short ladder, fitting the second-to-last board into its numbered position. Mott watched for a moment. Then he said, "Looks like you got it closed up." She said she had. He said, "What did you put in there?" She told him, briefly, accurately, without either defensiveness or the enthusiasm of someone who wants to be believed. Clay and chaff and sawdust in the north wall, ash and river grass in the east. She explained the principle in 2 sentences. Heat stored in dense material, released slowly through the night. Mott sat on his horse and considered this for longer than I would have expected from a man who had already formed his opinion. Then he said, "That's a great deal of work for a theory." Astrid fitted the last board into its position. "It is not a theory," she said. "My father built 4 walls this way in Norway. I helped him build 2 of them. I have been in those walls in a telemark winter, which is not a warm place. I know what they do," Mott said. "This isn't Norway." She said, "The clay does not know that." He made a sound that was not agreement and not dismissal and rode on toward his property. He mentioned the conversation to his wife that evening, Margaret told me years later, and he was not contemptuous when he recounted it. He was, she said, thinking out loud, which for Clarence Mott was different from talking. He did not come to a conclusion that evening. He did not come to a conclusion for 2 more months. But the conversation was in him, sitting alongside the arithmetic of chord estimates and cold night temperatures, and it did its work quietly in the weeks that followed. The first serious storm of the season arrived on the 15th of November. It was not the storm that would define that winter. It was, in retrospect, a kind of preview, the snow winter announcing its intentions before making its full argument. The temperature dropped 22 degrees in a single afternoon, from a workable 28 above to 6 below, and the wind came from the northeast with the particular persistence of early season cold that has all winter ahead of it and is in no hurry. Snow fell for 18 hours. Not the heaviest snowfall of the year, that would come later, but sufficient to block roads, lose cattle that had been left in the wrong pasture, and make the interiors of every single board cabin in the county feel like the cold was not outside the wall, but inside it, sitting in the corner, waiting. I was in my rented room in Walhalla that night, close enough to a good stove, and I was not uncomfortable. But I thought about the Voss place. I thought about the open east wall, and then I remembered it was closed now, and I thought about the north wall behind its replaced boards with its 4 feet of clay and chaff fill, and I tried to calculate what that wall was doing at that moment, whether it was doing anything at all, whether what she had understood from her father's ledger and her own hands was actually a transferable thing, or only a memory that seemed more reliable than it was. I did not write out to check. I was 23 years old, and it was a storm, and it was not my business. Astrid, as I learned later, woke at 2 in the morning and did what she had been doing since the north wall was finished. She took her small iron thermometer and held it at shoulder height in the center of the room, and she waited for the reading to stabilize, and she wrote the number in her ledger. Then she crossed to the north wall and pressed her palm flat against the inner boards and held it there for a slow count of 10. Then she crossed to the south wall, still unfilled, standard single-board construction, and did the same. The difference was not large. Perhaps 5 or 6 degrees of surface temperature, which does not sound significant until you consider that this was measured at 2 in the morning, 8 hours after the last substantial fire, with the outside temperature at 6 degrees below zero and the wind still running hard from the northeast. 5 or 6 degrees at 2 in the morning, after 8 hours without serious fire. In a wall that was half clay and half a compromised material she had developed from ash and river grass, because the river froze before she was finished. She wrote in her ledger, "North wall works, east wall works less well, but works. The clay holds." Father was right about everything he was right about. Then she added in a line below, "Not enough wood in this county if the walls stay as they are. That is not my problem to solve. My problem is solved." November passed. December arrived with the steady intention of a season that knows it has months ahead of it and does not need to make its entire argument in the first week. I was cutting and hauling timber through most of December, working for Mott on a contract to build a new equipment shed before the ground froze too deep for post-setting. I rode past the Voss place several times. The cabin looked as it had always looked, small, gray, settled into the flat land with the particular modesty of structures that are not trying to impress anyone. no visible indication that anything had been done to it. The smoke from her chimney rose straight on still days, bent hard on windy ones, the same as every other chimney in the county. What was different was invisible, and I did not know yet what to do with knowledge I could not see. Ruth Hansen stopped by the Voss place on a Thursday in mid-December, as she occasionally did. They were the closest Norwegian speakers to each other in the area, and the shared language was a practical comfort in a country where English was necessary but not always sufficient for the things that actually needed to be said. Ruth told me later what the visit had been like. She said the cabin felt different from the moment she came through the door. Not dramatically warmer than outside. It was afternoon. The fire had been going. Any cabin would have been warm, but she came back the following morning, early, before Astrid had built the day's fire up, and the warmth was still there in a way that her own cabin was never warm in the early morning of a cold December day. She did not say anything about it that first morning. She drank her coffee and watched her breath, which in her own cabin at that hour showed as faint vapor and in this cabin did not show at all. She went home and thought about it with the particular quality of attention that a woman with 3 children in a cold cabin brings to evidence of warmth. She did not knock on Astrid's door again until January gave her no other choice. The signs of what was coming were visible in December to anyone paying attention. I told my grandnephew that September evening, and most people in Pembina County were paying attention. They had learned to over the winters before. A man who ignores what the sky is saying in November ends up in trouble in January. And trouble in January on the Dakota Plains was not the kind of trouble that gave you a second chance to learn from it. The Crow people in the territory had already said, before the first snow, that this would be a winter that tested the foundations of things. They said it plainly to the people who would listen, which were fewer than it should have been. But they said it. Astrid Voss was ready. She did not know yet that she was the only person within 4 miles who was. The storm that arrived on the 12th of January, 1881, was not the largest storm of that winter. I want to be precise about that, because there is a tendency in the telling of difficult events to make the worst moment the biggest moment, to match the scale of the crisis to the scale of the weather. The storm of January 12th was severe. The temperature dropped to 38 below zero by midnight. The wind ran northeast at 50 miles an hour for 31 consecutive hours and drove the snow horizontally across the bottomland in a way that reduced visibility to the length of a man's arm. 3 families along the river lost cattle they could not bring to shelter in time. The road to Walhalla was impassable for 4 days, but there were larger storms that winter, earlier and later. What made January 12th the storm that I have thought about nearly every January for the past 50 years was not its size. It was what happened inside it. Per Hansen had 2 horses in a lean-to shelter on the east side of his property. The lean-to was adequate for Dakota winters of the kind that Pembina County had experienced in the previous 5 years. It was not adequate for the snow winter, and Per had known since December that it was not adequate. And he had been intending to reinforce it and had not yet done so, because there is always something more immediately necessary than the thing you know needs doing. On the evening of January 12th, when the storm had been running for 6 hours and the temperature was already at 20 below and dropping, he went out to check that the horses had not broken through the lean-to's south wall, which had been showing weakness for 2 weeks. He told Ruth he would be back in 10 minutes. He was gone for 40. When he came through the door, his coat was sheeted with ice from the collar to the knee. He pulled off his outer gloves, and Ruth saw his hands, and what she saw in his right hand she recognized with the specific recognition of someone who has seen that particular color and that particular stillness in extremities before, and knows what it means and what it can become. The outer 2 fingers were waxy, not white, past white, into the gray yellow of tissue that has lost its argument with the cold. He could not feel them. When she touched them, he did not react, not because he was being stoic, but because the sensation was simply not arriving. Ruth had lost 2 fingers of her own left hand to frostbite on the wagon trail north 7 years before. She had lost them because the warming had been done incorrectly, too fast, too direct, a well-meaning woman pressing her hands too close to a stove because warmth was warmth and more of it seemed better. She had learned from that loss in the way that you only learn from losses that stay with you in the body. She knew that what Per's fingers needed was not heat. They needed ambient warmth, surrounding, constant, moderate, the kind that would bring the tissue back slowly enough for the returning circulation to do its work without causing the damage that rapid rewarming inflicted on flesh that had been cold that long. She needed a warm room, not a hot stove, a warm room. Her own cabin, with its standard walls and its fire burning as high as she dared run it, measured perhaps 42 degrees in the corners away from the stove at this hour. The stove itself was very hot, and the air immediately above it was very hot, and neither of these was what Per's fingers needed. She wrapped his hand in dry wool and held it at chest level and thought for a very short time before she made a decision. She told Anders, who was 9 and steady, to keep the fire fed. She wrapped her heaviest shawl over her coat and went to the door. "You are going to the Voss place," Per said. It was not a question. "Yes," she said. He said nothing further. She went. I was not there for that crossing, but Ruth described it to me more than once over the following years, and each time she described it in essentially the same way, which is how you know when a person has a memory that has settled into its final form. She said she did not run. Running meant falling, and falling alone in that cold, in that visibility, meant a problem considerably worse than the one she was already managing. She walked in the direct line between her door and Astrid's, which she knew well enough to hold even when she could not see it. And she counted her steps because counting kept the part of her mind that was beginning to calculate the odds occupied with something other than the calculation. She said the cold at that hour was not like ordinary cold. It was not the cold that made you uncomfortable or even the cold that made you afraid. It was the cold that made you precise. Every decision mattered in a way that concentrated the mind to a single clear point. She counted her steps. She held her line. She reached Astrid's door in a time she estimated as 4 minutes, which I calculate against the distance as a pace that was faster than a walk and slower than anything that could be called running, which is exactly the pace you would choose if you understood the situation. Astrid had the door open before Ruth knocked. She had been awake because she was often awake at this hour in serious cold, and she had seen the shape moving across the snow in the way you can see movement in a storm, even when you cannot see the thing that is moving. Ruth told her about Per's fingers in a sentence and a half. Astrid had her coat on in less than a minute. They went back through the storm together, which was harder than coming had been, because the wind was now directly in their faces. Ruth described Astrid moving through it with the unhurried steadiness of someone who has decided that the cold is a fact to be managed rather than an adversary to be fought, which is a distinction that sounds philosophical but is, in practice, the difference between useful action and wasted energy. In the Hansen cabin, Astrid examined Per's hand. She removed the wool wrapping, looked at the 2 fingers in the lamplight for a long moment without touching them, then replaced the wrapping loosely and looked at Ruth. "He needs to come to my place," she said. Per started to speak. Ruth was already getting his coat. "My walls have been charged since 6 o'clock, Astrid said, which was not an explanation that meant anything to Per at that moment, but which Ruth, who had stood in that cabin and felt what its walls felt like on a December morning before the fire was built, understood in her body before she understood it in her mind. The whole room runs at 55 degrees without the stove. His hand needs 6 hours of that. Not the stove. The room. They came back through the storm, the 3 of them, with Anders following behind because Ruth would not leave him alone in the cold cabin with the 2 younger children, and Per holding his wrapped hand against his chest and saying nothing, which was itself a kind of communication. The contrast, when they came through Astrid's door, arrived before any of them had time to prepare for it. Per stopped just inside the threshold. He had the expression of a man who has walked into something his body understands before his mind does. The warmth was not coming from the stove, which was burning at a moderate level in the corner, a maintenance fire, not a heating fire. The warmth was coming from the walls, from the floor, from the air itself, which held its temperature the way the air in a stone church holds its temperature, not from a source, but from the accumulated patience of dense material that has been taking in heat for hours and is now giving it back without drama or hurry. Astrid settled Per in the chair closest to the north wall, the wall with the deepest clay fill, and removed the wrapping from his hand. She positioned his hand so that it rested a few inches from the wall's surface without touching it, close enough to receive the radiant warmth the wall was producing, not so close that the contact would be direct. She covered his lap with a wool blanket and put a second chair beside him where Ruth could sit. Then she built the fire up. Not for now, she said, feeding in 3 good sections of split pine. For tomorrow night and the night after. The stones, the wall, needs to be recharged. We are using what it stored this evening. Per looked at the wall beside him. He said, in Norwegian, something that Ruth translated for me years later as, "It's like sitting next to a person." He meant it as an observation, not as a compliment. But Astrid took it as the more accurate description she had heard. Yes, she said, that is what it should feel like. Over the next 2 hours, the color began returning to Per's fingers. Not quickly. Quickly would have been wrong. Slowly, from the base toward the tip, the gray-yellow receding and the normal pink of living tissue following behind it. He began to feel them again around the 2nd hour, which was painful in the specific way that returning circulation is painful, and the pain was, in this case, the correct result. By the 4th hour, both fingers were fully recovered. Dr. Stiles, who came the following morning summoned by a note Ruth had sent with Anders at first light, examined them thoroughly and said he would not have believed the outcome without seeing it himself, and then he took out his notebook and began asking Astrid questions that she answered with the same direct accuracy she brought to all practical conversation. Stiles spent 2 hours in that cabin. He measured the wall thickness, recorded the interior temperature at 3 different points in the room, asked about the mix ratios and the curing times and the decision-making process for the east wall's substitute material. He wrote quickly, in the compressed hand of a man who has learned to capture information before the moment that contains it passes. He said, when he was done, "This is a public health matter as much as a building matter. Cold interiors cause illness. They cause the kind of illness that kills children and old people and anyone whose body is already working hard for other reasons. You have built something that keeps a room warm through a night without requiring a person to tend the fire every 2 hours. Do you understand what that means for families with 1 adult?" Astrid said she understood what it meant for a widow on her own. He said he was going to write it up and send it to the territorial government. She said she hoped it would be useful. She refilled his coffee and he wrote for another 20 minutes before the storm required him to leave for his own shelter. The report was sent. 3 times, as I have already told you, it was never answered. Clarence Mott came to her door on the 9th of April when the snow had been retreating for 2 weeks and the mud season had begun its own particular tyranny. He came alone. He brought nothing. He stood in the center of the cabin and turned slowly, the way I had turned in April when I first stood in that room with my measuring tape and tried to understand what I was inside. He put his hand on the north wall and left it there for a long time. Then he asked about the clay. She told him what to look for in the riverbank when the thaw opened it up. The color, the way it coiled when rolled thin, the specific gray-blue that meant density rather than the lighter gray that meant sand content too high for the purpose. She told him about the chaff ratio and the importance of curing time between layers. She told him about the corner, which mattered most, and the mistake she had made the first time with the water content, and how she had identified the mistake and corrected it. He listened with the complete attention of a man who has stopped thinking about whether to believe something and has moved on to thinking about how to do it. He asked 3 technical questions. Her answers were specific. He nodded at each one in the way of a man who is filing information rather than responding to it. When she was done, he said, "I'll need to know I'm reading the clay right before I commit to the full project. Will you come look at what I find in the bank?" She said she would come in May when the bank was accessible. He thanked her, briefly, practically, in the way of someone for whom gratitude is a real thing, but not a demonstrative one. He put his hat on and left. That was Clarence Mott's accounting. It was, given who he was and what it cost him, considerable. I closed my measuring book that April morning in Astrid's cabin and looked at what I had written. Dimensions, materials, ratios, the specific geometry of the corner treatment. Practical information, recorded by a trained hand. I rode home and I used what I had learned for the rest of my working life in every house I built in Pembina County where the client would accept the additional cost of the thicker walls. 7 houses. 7 families warmer than their neighbors in January without fully understanding why. I did not say Astrid Voss's name as often as I should have. I told myself there was no natural opening in the conversation. I told myself that clients wanted to know the technique worked, not the history of how I had come to know it. I told myself various things across various years that were individually plausible and collectively insufficient. She left the territory in 1893. The cabin was sold, the walls intact. 12 years of hard winters behind them, performing exactly as her father's ledger had described and her own hands had built. She is gone now. The cabin is gone. The clay went back to the river it came from, in the end, as most things go back to what they came from. But 2 miles east of Walhalla, there is a white house with a red barn that I built in the spring of 1887. The Lindqvist family has lived in it since 1902. They have 4 children, and they keep a good garden. And in January, when I drive past it on the road to town, I can tell from the windows that the house is warm, not just heated, warm, in the bone-deep way that only comes from walls that have learned to hold what they are given. The Lindqvists do not know why their house stays warmer than their neighbors through the night. I have driven past that house for nearly 30 years, and I have never stopped to explain it to them. My grandnephew looked at me when I said that. He did not say anything for a moment. Then he said, "Should I write it down?" I looked north, at the flat line of the horizon, at the sky beginning to go the color of pewter in the way it does in September when the light is withdrawing and the first cold of the coming season is still a month away, but already making itself known to anyone paying attention. "Yes," I said, "that is exactly what you should do." I got up, my knees working in their usual fashion, and went inside to find something for supper. He stayed on the porch for a while longer as the light went. I did not look back, but I believed he was writing. I still believe it.